what this research with music shows is that when you have people making music together, when they're just tapping in rhythm or singing in harmony or in unison, that you get people making more friendly, pro-social decisions. So you reduce the rate of people who are sort of going against the grain and sort of making things worse for everybody.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the Power of Music Thinking. My name is Christoph Zürn, and this is the podcast for people with a musical heart and a wicked job. We're looking for stories, insights and tools from the big world of music to inspire leaders and followers to listen, tune, play and perform in whatever field you're operating. Today we're in Singapore. We talk with Benjamin Pelzer, assistant professor of the We Can We School of Communication and Information at Nanyang Technological University. Ben is trained in music theory and psychology. He works as an assistant professor and scientist with expertise in the methods of cognitive neuroscience, machine learning, computational social science, and empirical psychology. And Ben is teaching a one-of-its-kind course in the world of research on music as a sort of socio-cultural phenomenon, and is using techniques from the field of communication and applying them to the field of music. We talk about how music and sounds can drive a particular scene of a film in two opposite ways using a positive or negative valence soundtrack. And that music is almost uniquely powerful in its deeply emotional impact and the ability to evoke complex or more profound lasting emotions. Ben shares with us that there are some universal features of music, like low tones are connected with sinister or aggressive emotions that are part of the evolution when big animals were a severe threat. And he conveys insights from a little survey he did with the multicultural students of his music course for the Power of Music Thinking podcast about how they listen to music in the context of Asia. In his music course, Ben also reflects with his students questions like, if you were alive 1,000 years ago, what role would music have played in your life? And the realization that for people outside of wealth and royalty, it would be folk instruments or just the human voice. So if you wanted to hear music, you would make it yourself or go to a performance by someone else. This is something that especially younger people don't think about, because they are so used to listening to almost any song you could want. And that's why the current moment is such an outlier in human history. For some themes we talk about, I have put links in the show notes, and if you have a look at them, please consider to subscribe, make a comment, and give us a rating. This will help us a lot to get the show going. And good to know we had some connection issues, so please excuse the little dropouts near the end. All right, let's start. Good afternoon, Ben. Welcome to the Power of Music Thinking.
Hi, Christoph. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation and to sharing some things that are hopefully interesting to your listeners.
Sure, we will. I know. Ben, what was your first sonic experience or album or live performance that had an impact on you?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I really love it. I'm going to cheat a little bit and not give just one. I grew up hearing the music, mostly my dad's music, a lot of progressive rock from sort of the 70s, as well as shading into heavy metal. One experience that I had in high school that started to send me in a different direction was my one of my high school band directors played in the symphony orchestra in my hometown. And he was involved in a performance, and he suggested that some of us attend, and it was Messiaen's Turangalila.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, which is just it completely blew my mind and redefined what music could be.
So Olivier
And
Messiaen Turangalila, one of his most famous pieces with a very interesting instrument.
yeah, definitely
And Martineau.
yeah, exactly. This very sort of sci-fi sounding
Ah, cool.
uh instrument. And then one other experience that I'll sneak in just because it has a connection to you is um it's probably not the very first time, but it's the very first time that I can remember being sort of almost, I mean, spiritual might not be the right word, but being really, really moved by music was there's a series of organ concerts in Stevenskerk in Nanyang
Mm.
when I was there. And those concerts and playing around with, just moving around and experiencing the different overtones and just the really immersing myself in that sonic experience
Yeah.
was, yeah, just another musical experience that I can definitely call easily to mind.
Wow, nice. So we have to tell the people you've studied a half a year in Nijmegen, where I live and where I now record the podcast. But you're at the moment in Singapore.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I'm at the Nanyang Technological University in Singapore.
So Ben, can you tell us a little bit more about you? Who are you? What do you do for a living?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm an assistant professor of communication neuroscience at NTU. So I'm in the School of Communication here. My background is not in communication at all. It's actually in psychology as well as in music theory. So during my bachelor's studies, I did a dual degree in music theory and psychology. And for various reasons, I made the decision as I went forward in academia to focus on the psychology side of that instead of the music side of that, mostly with an eye towards sort of future employability and how large the research field was in each of those respective domains. So during my graduate studies, I focused on cognitive neuroscience. And during that time, I was really interested in data analysis, machine learning, various advanced techniques. And for me, what's interesting is I actually can see how that links to my interest in music theory. I mean, it's basically music theory is sort of one way of thinking about it is trying to quantify music, to turn music into numbers, trying to understand the inner details of the musical experience. I was also thinking during my bachelor studies as well a lot about music cognition. So trying to relate different properties of music to the impacts that those have on listeners. Fast forward to the present day. And as I said, I'm doing communication neuroscience. And my research primarily combines different techniques drawn from machine learning, from cognitive neuroscience, and from media psychology. And I focus on the dynamics in the brain while people are consuming or engaging with media. So while you're watching a film, for instance, or potentially while you're listening to a piece of music. And within that niche, I also think a lot about sort of individual differences and audience segmentation. So that's a little bit about what I do, but what I think is most relevant to what you're doing is that during my time as a professor, I was given the opportunity to propose a new course, and it's more or less one of its kind in the world, where I'm looking at and presenting to the students research on music as a sort of socio-cultural phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
And the unique angle is that I'm either drawing on theories from the field of communication or just borrowing sort of techniques or ways of thinking from the field of communication and applying those to music.
Wow. That's quite a lot.
Yeah.
And the link was that you reacted on the episode with Glenn MacDonald from Spotify.
Mm-hmm.
And that's
Yeah,
so
exactly.
if people have heard that episode, so they are already, let's say, warned in that way that they can expect much more or a different take on what I talked with Glenn a few weeks ago. So that's a very nice link. Okay, let's cycle back to what do you mean by quantify music? And is it the music that you quantify or the listening? So actually doing the link with the episode with Glenn, he's all about listening data and behavior data. So
Mm.
what does your quantify music mean?
Right. So, I mean, that's a really good question. There's two ways of approaching it. One is just to think about the artifact in isolation. And I think that that's the approach that probably most music theorists would say that they take. So just taking the score, for instance, and doing various sorts of analyses to understand what techniques the composer was using, and the sort of the apotheosis, the end point of this might be analyzing 12-tone music where they're using very rigorous rules and there are sets and combinatorics, and
Right.
it's very, very sort of math inspired.
I would
And
merely say this is a little bit like musicology. That's what I studied years ago. To dive
right.
into one of the pieces, try to understand what it is and what the composer did. And also interesting that it differs very much from different kinds of compositions.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, even within that sort of approach, just focusing on the artifact, there's sort of a quantitative approach or a qualitative approach, just in terms of, yeah, the background, the training of the music theorist. But you're absolutely right that another way of thinking about and quantifying music is, and in some sense, it's because music is designed to be heard by people. The approach of understanding the music through the lens of the impacts that it has on the listeners is so that's more I think that that's more music psychology, or cognitive musicology. There's different terms for it, but yeah, it's the other side of the coin. And it's I mean, these are basically those were my two interests, was the more mathematical side of what's happening in the music on its own, as well as trying to understand the impact that it had on the listeners.
Imagine that when you're a composer and you're busy bringing everything, all your ideas into a composition. And then it depends if you just write a score and you need an orchestra or someone else to play it, or you're in a studio composer and you can manipulate everything so as you want it. And I wonder if they think about that impact very much. So maybe in pop music, I can imagine, because in popular music, a producer is always market driven, or yeah, if they're a professional producer, they're always market driven, because the investment they do in the studio, they want to have it back. Compared to if you take the composition that you just mentioned, Messiaen, it was the second part of the 20th century. And he composed with a new instrument, an electronic instrument, an Aunt Martineau. So if people know what a theremin is, the sound is a little bit comparable, but it's played in a totally different way. And it's a beautiful, beautiful composition. And talking about impact, Messiaen was a Catholic. And everything that he did and that he was doing was that impact was clear. So I like very much these how they combined. And are you researching this? So what would be a subject of your research to show these two sides, the artifact one and the impact one?
Yeah. So my research is not primarily on music. So there is music in some of the stimuli that I use. So I do primarily brain imaging, and examples of the sorts of studies that I run would be that I have people watch, for example, clips from films while their brain activity is being recorded. And I'm using that to try to understand something about essentially the relationship between the properties of the films and their brain activity. I do similar research using advertising. So having people watch short ads while their brain activity is being scanned, and using that to essentially try to predict the effectiveness of the ads. So some of those film clips, some of those ads will have music, but it's at this point, it's something that I take note of and can sort of do analyses just to see whether the presence of music or not has an impact. But I'm not doing sort of analyses of different musical cues in terms of the impact it has in the processes that I'm studying.
Is there a difference when people watch, let's say, an ad without music, or maybe also music is not the only thing, without sound? And is it an extra effect, or is it a stronger effect? Because sometimes people say that branding with music is much more stronger than just a visual. Is this right?
Yeah, it's definitely right. So I don't, from my research, I don't have sort of enough evidence to speak to that, but I know I'm familiar enough with the evidence from other researchers, and it's definitely the case that you get very, very different effects if people are watching a clip. And I mean, you can do this if you spend a few minutes on YouTube. You can find examples of clips. I know there's one, for instance, from the 90s Jurassic Park, where you can watch the scene with or without music. And just in terms of the emotional experience, in terms of even how you perceive the scene, in terms of the things that you notice on the screen, or the actors' expressions, things like that, are very heavily influenced by whether there's music or not. And there are a lot of different types of effects. Generally speaking, a lot of the research tends to focus on the emotional effects because it's sort of the most obvious and also, in some sense, the most quantifiable. A lot of the rest is gets much more into sort of this qualia, this hard to pin down subjective experience. Whereas psychologists are reasonably well equipped to study emotion. And yeah, it's absolutely the case that you can take an ambiguous or a neutral scene, for instance, and completely drive people to perceive it essentially in completely opposite ways, just by using either sort of positively coded or positively valenced, negatively valenced soundtrack, and you'll get exactly opposite interpretations of the same scene. And of course, when you have some sort of emotion that's inherent in the scene, then you tend to get these sort of super additive effects where the music accentuates it even further.
So this means if people listen now to us from, let's say, more from a business perspective, and they have a marketing budget to spend, would you say think more about the audio part of your communication? Is that what you say?
Yeah, absolutely. I can't speak. I don't have enough background in sort of visual design to be able to tease apart the relative influence of the audio component, the sound component, versus the visual component. But there's just a substantial amount of evidence demonstrating that music is almost uniquely powerful in terms of its ability to evoke emotions, especially sort of complex or deeper or longer lasting emotions. There's, you can use visual imagery, and there's sort of a classic set of images, for instance, that's used in a lot of psychological studies, where you'll have incredibly positively valenced pictures, puppies and things of that nature, and then very negatively valenced pictures from, for instance, places where there are wars or things like that. And those obviously evoke strong emotions, but the ability of music to really evoke these sort of deeper and longer lasting emotions is quite profound.
I just think about in one of the early episodes, I spoke with Steve Keller, and he's the audio alchemist. When I spoke with him, he watched or listened to a lot of, in COVID time, to all these advertisement to tell people what they should do during COVID. And what I found so interesting is that he said, but all the voices were white. Meaning, so if you want to reach a different kind of people and you just do it from a certain perspective, from a language or even the sound or the quality, think about how this will come over to people that should follow or should understand what they should do. So I found this a very, very interesting thing. So this goes a little bit in that direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's very important, and this is one thing that I try to focus on especially in teaching my class. Being an American myself, but obviously in Southeast Asia, I sort of have an obligation to step outside of that very narrow Western focused background, and that's at least I think most people who are being trained, for instance, in music theory or music history, it's primarily focused on that Western perspective. But of course, different listeners coming from different cultures will receive music in different ways. There are some universals, like there are features of music that scholars have traced back to, for instance, evolutionary origins, thinking about the ways that the musical cues echo vocal cues, for example. So this is why sometimes. Well, so like if you have a low pitch, for example, that is typically used to denote something that's sort of sinister or aggressive or things of that nature. Loud sounds as well are aggressive. And thinking in sort of an evolutionary psychological way, you can understand that because deep sounds come from large. I mean, thinking back to when the only sounds you would hear were essentially vocal sounds, right? Animals vocalizing, humans vocalizing. So the larger an animal, the deeper the sound, and also the more danger that animal posed. So there are some universals like that where people across all cultures will tend to have some basic reactions to certain musical cues that are in common. But I would say that the differences between the musics of different cultures vastly outweigh the commonalities. So you definitely can't presume that listeners from different, I mean, even within, a single country, coming from, different cultural backgrounds, could nonetheless have quite different perceptions of, the same piece of music.
Right. So we have the universals and maybe the individuals. So the universal are what you just said, like a low sound is something like from, "Whoa, what's going on? What is this?" It's profound. It could be big. And a bird sound, for example, a lot of people say if you hear birds, so, it feels like, okay, everything is okay. And then when suddenly the bird sounds stop, it's like, so even the silence can be very, very profound. You mentioned your course. What kind of course is it? And can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Yeah, sure. So it's a general education course for undergrads, which means that it's students who are doing their bachelor's from all across the university. So I have, most of my students aren't coming from the School of Communication, but instead they're engineers and physicists and mathematicians and sociologists. So all a huge mix from the humanities, from engineering, from the hard sciences.
And so your music course unites the people. So that's also, I think, very charming to bring everyone together with, and then teach them about music. So with everybody with a different perspective. Nice.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's something that I really try to emphasize as I'm putting together activities. For instance, I have group activities, and I construct the groups so that we have a mix of students from the social sciences, hard sciences, humanities, so that they sort of get exposed to people with different perspectives. And um, I'm assuming, I'm assuming that no one in the class has a strong dislike of music, but I don't know the degree to which the people in the class, are musicians themselves or relate strongly to music, or there's certainly a lot of them where the course just fit their schedule, or they took it for idiosyncratic reasons.
Hmm.
But yeah, so that's a lot of fun to, because in academia we can get into our silos, and by the time you're working as a professor, you tend to be working within a niche of a niche, hyper specialized, and you can lose sight of big picture principles that are really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a lot of fun to have these students from diverse backgrounds and get to think about, first of all, get to think about music that I haven't, in a way that I haven't thought about for probably 10 years or longer, since I was doing my own undergraduate work, but also to think about my current field of communication, and just really, what are the important principles or concepts that I can bring these two topics together in a way that is informative and interesting to these people from so many different kinds of backgrounds.
You get back to the very early beginnings of music. Can you tell us a little bit more how this works? Because I imagine that when we talk with music, and I would say especially with younger people, but that's an assumption, that they never think about where music comes from, and that people in 40,000 years ago tried to make a flute from a bone. How far are you going, and how does this, and what's the impact on your students if you share it with them?
Yeah, sure. So I do, the course as a whole is actually also called How Music Speaks. Just because it was sort of a pithy way of getting across that idea of combining communication and music. And yeah, I cover a few different sort of big picture topics of the intersection between communication and music. But one of the things that I do very early on in the semester is what you just alluded to. First I just have the students sort of think about what is music, and just, talk about examples of things where people might disagree, whether it constitutes music or not, different types of, noise music, basically, things like that. John Cage, of course. But yeah, one of the other things that I do in those first couple of weeks is go through the history of music going back 40 or, if you include proto music, some scholars talk about going back 400,000 years ago. But music as we would understand it today, generally we can talk pretty safely about 40,000 years ago. And because the conceit of the course is this focus on music in a more all-encompassing sense, so not just the notes, not just the recordings, but the experience of music, again, sort of the socio-cultural phenomenon of music. That's really helpful, I think, to walk students through and have them think about, if you were alive 2,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 100 years ago, just what role would music have played in your life? And of course, for most of the history of music, for most people, outside of the very wealthy or people who were royalty, things like that, it was maybe some folk instruments, but for the most part, it was just the human voice. So if you wanted to hear music, you would make it yourself. And of course, up until the advent of recording, you either had to make it yourself or go see it performed by someone else. So I think that that's, like you said, that's just something that most, especially younger people, don't tend to think about. I mean, we're so used to being able to listen to pretty much any song that we can want on demand. I mean, everybody has, Spotify and things like that these days. That to realize that this is the current moment is such an outlier, is so atypical relative to the vast majority of human history that, I mean, as a music lover, I'm sure you'll agree, it's a very exciting time to be alive, to have such access to such a broad array of music on demand. But it's very much not the norm for most of human history.
Absolutely. I like that question very much. And I think it's also, so the listener that now listens to all of us and all the scientific things that we that we talk about, but it's a very profound question. What if, or imagine 50 years, 100 years, or maybe just go back, how your, let's say, your parent or your grandfather, when they had your age, so we keep it very open, and think about what did they hear, maybe just to start with hearing, and what and how were they listening to? I think that's a very profound question. And maybe if people, because we have pictures since the last, 150 years, also personal pictures, they can see, oh, what is this? Oh, then you could imagine how it would sound. But we don't have a sound from that time. I think one of the earliest recording is, or so that people record in their family. That's maybe just 70 years ago. So it also depends on, could you afford recording equipment? So, but that's a very, very nice thing. And in our pre-talk, I think you had the idea that we also could ask the students some questions, and you made a little survey about it. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, just in as you said, as we were discussing, sort of opportunities. Obviously, one of the interesting opportunities for, given my situation, is that I'm located here in a part of your world that may not be too familiar to a lot of your listeners. So obviously Singapore is quite an international country. I'm sure a lot of your listeners may have visited, but nonetheless, to sort of, it is quite distinct from a lot of European countries, from the US. So just thought it would be interesting to find out how my students sort of interact with music, the role that it plays in their lives. And unsurprisingly, I mean, one of the themes of the last, sort of this broad overview of music history is this trend towards homogenization, the trend towards Western influence. Mm-hmm. And so the students in my class, who are mostly Singaporeans, there are some exchange students who are coming from Europe, from the US, mm-hmm. But it's mostly Singaporeans. But they use music for essentially the same purposes and through essentially the same channels as you would get if you asked this question in the US, if you asked it in Europe. So they report using the music for relaxation, to set an ambiance, to manage their mood or emotional state, just to pass the time while they're commuting. And they're listening through TikTok, through YouTube, through Spotify, occasionally on the radio, if they're in the taxi or something like that. Just listening while they're exercising, for instance, is another common association. So I think there's, from that side, I would say that these students are pretty indistinguishable from the students at least in the contexts I'm familiar with, again, in Europe and the US. One other thing that's not exactly unique, but that certainly stands out about Singapore is that it's very multicultural. So there are a lot of different cultures that sort of combined as Singapore became an independent state. And that means that there's a lot of different musical traditions. And for the older generation, it's very clear that this more traditional music plays a larger role. So it's very common going to malls or in taxis or things like that. If you have, for instance, an older or if you encounter somebody who's ethnic Chinese and from the older generation, it's not at all uncommon for them to be playing to hear then traditional Chinese music. But for these students, again, like I think most young people around the world, they don't have a strong, and they also don't have sort of much exposure or experience with the musics of the other cultures. So they might have some familiarity with the traditional music of their own culture, although most of them aren't too interested in it.
All right.
But yeah, from other cultures, it's almost invisible.
But this means the traditional or the older cultures music will go away in some way because the listeners don't listen anymore. And if we don't record it, then it will be really not be available. And one of my questions in that regard was in my book, I'm talking about different positions of leadership, and I mention and it just mention, let's say, four different directions. And one direction would be more the classical music, where let's say like a composer like Olivier Messiaen has a fantastic idea and he writes everything down in a score, and he needs specialists to play this. So the conductor would be really dive into this system, and the listening would be something that you might have never heard before, and maybe later also would be compared to everything that you hear later is so different. On the other hand, there would be a producer, and that's when we talk about popular music, it's market driven, and it's about like, okay, we have an investment to go into the studio and to work on. So we want that money back in some way, and we do what people like or will like. And another direction would be improvisation, just to make music on the fly and act and interact. So I would say there's maybe the most direct communication on stage, for example. So that is evolving. So because you could also compose that dialogue in the other music, but improvisation it could go everywhere. And then I have one corner that I call the guru or the folk music, traditional, or all these musics that might go away, but have a very profound, also different, often also ritual function. And my question always is, if I show this or talk about this different direction, do people really understand what I mean? Do they have a reference to music where they say, oh, hang on, oh, that's interesting? Or like talking about gamelan music from Bali or Java, that is very played in a special way, also by an orchestra, but from a different orchestra. And as far as I know, there are also scores, but totally different scores. So what's your take on this? So is it going away? Shall we preserve it? Is there any use to show it or to let them hear what it is?
Right. I think it's going to differ a lot from culture to culture, just in terms of sort of the importance that the members of a culture, for instance, put on tradition. Some cultures, that's sort of elevating tradition or having a high regard for tradition is a central part of the culture itself. in other cultures, that's just not, not sort of a central theme. And so definitely in cultures where there is a focus on tradition, I think those musics have a better chance of being preserved. Um, it's hard to know. I'm not familiar with any research on this. Obviously, young people tend to be less interested in tradition. I think we can pretty safely say across a lot of cultures. And then as they get older, they get more interested in tradition. So it may be that this older generation that that we can hear playing traditional Chinese music around Singapore. Maybe when they were youths, they also had no interest in that, and they only discovered that interest as they got older. Two other things come to mind. One is even in a country like Japan, which tends to, I think, have more of a focus on sort of preserving tradition. The government was actually so concerned, I think this was in the 90s, about just what you were talking about, the loss of traditional music, in particular folk song, that they undertook a large sort of centralized project to preserve as much folk music as they could. So even though that's a culture that we might think of as being more oriented towards tradition, nonetheless, the government saw reasons for concern. One other sort of angle on this is that different actors can recognize the power of tradition. I mean, tradition sort of means it's this sort of set of symbols that carries a certain meaning to members of a culture. And so, for instance, governments will sometimes go through the process of what scholars occasionally talk about as inventing tradition. So they will create new music that's in the style of traditional music, which I think gets into a gray area in terms of whether that's actually preserving the tradition or if it's just sort of taking advantage of that association to achieve their own particular aims.
Yeah, right.
I don't think that we'll lose, worldwide. I'm sure that traditional musics will survive. It's just a question of diversity. Just like with languages, for instance, we know that the number of languages is decreasing. The same thing is happening with musics.
On the other hand, I think when people hear music for the first time, it's always new for them in some way. So there's always a chance to bring something that was very, let's say, old, traditional, and let them hear something. And I think maybe it will work when it's live music, maybe more. But that's an assumption from my side. Instead of just in the Spotify playlist, if there's something traditional in between, maybe they would skip. But that's also an assumption. You also talk about music as a tool. And that's something what I think it's very interesting, because music thinking is something where I say, okay, it's not about the music or not just about the music. There's much more behind the music that you could use in some way, or even use in the way that if there are musical principles and you make them simple enough so that you can use them in a different context. So what about your music as a tool thinking?
Yeah. I spend a lot of time in the course on topics that basically fall under this umbrella. So I talk a little bit about sort of explicitly communicating with music. For instance, there are studies showing that music can carry semantic meaning, that you can actually listen to a musical excerpt and understand it in the same way that you understand language. But that's relatively rare. Most of the sort of ways that you can use music as a tool, a lot of it has to do with emotion. And I break things down in terms of whether the listener has a choice in the matter, essentially, in what they're listening to.
Good point.
Yeah. So there's a lot of research out of the framework. It's called Uses and Gratifications. It's a communication theory. It's basically about how you use media, and I include music in that, to achieve particular goals. Like if you're feeling bored, you might sit down to watch an engaging movie. If you're feeling sad, you might try to listen to happy music to cheer you up, or you might sort of paradoxically listen to sad music in order to kind of get the emotions out and process them when the listener has agency. But of course, there are a lot of examples of music being used, not exactly against the listener's will, but where it's not, the listener isn't choosing to hear the music. So music in film, music in advertising, even things like music in stores or Muzak, workplace music.
That's what you mean with used by listeners. So I think the example would be, if I'm sad, I might like to hear the Passion from Bach, for example, just to make it even bigger and get it out and really feel that moment. And maybe later then I want to listen to happy music. This would be used by listeners, and used on listeners would be with the same knowledge. We try to, maybe the word manipulation also comes around the corner. We try to use music on listeners for a certain effect.
I mean, practitioners have to be really careful with this, though, because listeners are savvy, first of all. So if you are too obvious, listeners don't like feeling like they are being manipulated. So if your music is too obvious, then listeners will catch on to that, and you'll have sort of a boomerang effect. There are also just sort of quirky results. For instance, if you set happy lyrics to happy music, you get less happiness. If you have the happy lyrics with just neutral music, whereas with sad music and sad lyrics, the sadness sort of compounds. So it's not completely straight flat. You use the type of music to cause the emotional response that you want. There's interactions between what else is happening. So these days, the more sophisticated practitioners, you can almost think of it as sort of like tone painting, or thinking in terms of just colors. So not being too over the head on the listener in terms of the emotion that you're trying to evoke. But the more sophisticated uses do things like they support a narrative, for example. Okay. So you have a narrative on the screen, and you use the music in some way to synergize with the narrative that's happening on the screen,
to make it stronger, so that it's still the same. Yeah, that's I think that's a very important thing. And it just crosses my mind that when you go to Wagner opera, where he works with a lot of these little melodies, these leitmotif, he's calling them. So there's like the idea, there's someone getting on the stage, and you hear a certain theme in the orchestra, and the listener who really understand that whole system and whole theme, they would say, "Oh, he will die at the end of the end of the hour." So because there's some extra information, so that's maybe very the super sophisticated part. But I like that very much. So the idea to it's not just using music. So as a disclaimer to all the marketing managers that are out there, and just try do happy music and people will buy our product. It's much more sophisticated, and it's not just something that you just do. And maybe it should be, but that's my take on it. Should connect much more with your purpose, and that it makes the product perfect instead of just selling your idea.
Yeah, of course. I mean, there's so much effort in terms of sound branding, for instance, and how you get synergies between the visual design and the acoustic design and every element, of the sort of the overall campaign being fitting together nicely, being in harmony.
And also by sound branding, you have to understand that it should be very much on brand, so very much you, very much connected with your purpose and who you are. On the other hand, it will be heard in a context that is different with the listeners that might be totally different to you and might have a weaker effect or a different effect.
Yeah, it's, so much of it is about just shading around the edges, right? Just causing subtle effects or trying to present the same information through different channels. You have different customers. Some work very visually, some are more, in the auditory domain. And so if you can tell the same basic story through different channels, you're reaching more people. Obviously, you're always going to have people who come from a different culture, who listen to a different genres of music, things like that. You can't sort of get everyone, but there are some clear themes that come from research, and also that just come from practitioners doing this for a long time and being successful. There are things that you can do to reach a wide audience, I would say.
Thank you, Ben. That's quite a lot of information, quite a lot of insights. Is there something that we didn't touch, something that you would like to share?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's one other thing that I think could be interesting to your listeners from my course, which is about the social effects of music. So scholars who think about where did music come from, why does so much of humanity today engage in this ritual? They come up with different explanations, and one of the explanations is actually with reference to the social effects of music. Yeah, there are a few different sort of ways of thinking about this. One is a scholar named Christopher Small, and he talks about musicking. So this is the act of basically engaging in music as a ritual. It doesn't mean that you have to do it ritualistically, but just essentially anytime there is music, he thinks of it as being a ritual. And this can be performing music, it can be listening to music, but he even talks about, the stagehand who moves the piano onto the stage is involved, is engaging in musicking.
Absolutely. Just to add, I like this very much because that's what I mean with music thinking. It's not about the music; it's about everything that makes this music possible. And I like that one with the one who's moving the piano to on stage. It also does a contribution to that music, and I also think about how do you scale music. So it's not the orchestra has to get bigger and bigger and bigger, like in a Mahler 8 where you have 1,000 people playing. No, maybe you should think like a festival with different musics. So I like that idea very much, that it's not just about the music but everything that's involved in it. So this was one. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no, that's fine. So one of the things that Christopher Small focuses on in talking about musicking is he focuses on the idea that it allows people to experience different kinds of relationships. So relationships between the people involved in the experience and the physical setting, between the different participants in the musical experience, and between the sounds themselves. So it's all about different types of relationships, including social relationships. The other line, basically, of research that's really interesting and that I think could be interesting to your listeners is going back to this idea that music arose because it has effects on how we relate to other people. There's a lot of research showing that if you make music with other people, if you even just tapping in rhythm or singing in harmony or in unison with other people, it leads to, you can think of this as coordination. It can be physical coordination or just sound coordination, but this leads to cooperation and collaboration. So there are a lot of different studies. If you set people up in if you give them sort of psychological tasks, things like, some of your listeners may know the prisoner's dilemma. Basically, it's a situation where you can make different choices and there are some sort of pro-social, friendly choices and some anti-social, not so friendly choices. And if you basically, if one person is being antisocial, then everyone needs to be antisocial to sort of get to avoid the worst outcome, essentially. But what this research with music shows is that when you have people making music together, when they're just tapping in rhythm or singing in harmony or in unison, that you get people making more friendly, pro-social decisions. So you reduce the rate of people who are sort of going against the grain and sort of making things worse for everybody. So that's there's a lot of research supporting this idea that either making music together or listening to music together, brings people together. So what I was saying is that it doesn't just sort of bring people together in a physical space, but it actually does something to people's social brains that makes them act as a single entity. That makes them engage with one another on a deeper level socially.
I also do this sometimes in the workshops to let them engage in a group improvisation, and that's I also feel it's very strong because it comes from them, from their side. They contribute. So literally, they learn how to co-create, how to work together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Thank you very much for sharing this with us, and hope to hear more from everything that you're doing.
Yeah, thank you, Christoph. It was an interesting conversation, and I look forward to seeing what else you get up to.
Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate this because listening is one of the top leadership skills, and I feel honored about this. It is my mission to find, create, and share inspirations for meaningful collaboration based on music analogies. If you want to support this, please subscribe to the podcast, give us a rating, or write a review on iTunes or Spotify. And more inspirations can be found on musicthinking.com. We have a blog, and you can download the Music Thinking Framework. And finally, I would love to hear your feedback. And if you need help with a business challenge, please reach out to me via email, podcast@musicthinking.com.